Good morning. Thank you. If you all could please take your seat, we would like to begin the panel. I'm Toni Verstandig, Chair of the Middle East Programs here at the Aspen Institute. Thank you all for coming so early this morning. And as you can imagine, our region, the Middle East region, continues to provide enormous content and great information for our panels today. And I'm pleased to turn over this discussion today on democracy in the Middle East, Islamist liberals and the battle for the hearts and mind of the Arab Revolution, to my good friend and colleague, Andrea Mitchell. Andrea?
Thank you so much, Toni, and thanks for everything you're doing. Toni, as you know, is indefatigable in trying to bring the factions together and doing so much behind the scenes and has been for years. This is, for me, the highlight of my coming to Aspen because this is a subject I am passionate about, and the people here on stage are the most knowledgeable, and we are at such an inflection point. People, as Toni said, are pouring into the streets in Cairo. As we understand it, Richard's sources and mine from our people there in Cairo, it is unbearably hot there today. They expect the apex of the demonstration to be at 8 p.m. local time. They are marching towards the presidential palace. We had, of course, the day before yesterday, the tragic death of a young American intern from Chevy Chase, Maryland, who was working with Ted Kattouf's group and working there for the summer teaching English, and was stabbed during one of the protests. So this is beginning to explode again. Some are calling or predicting the second Egyptian revolution, and is only one piece of the growing secular Islamist divide in the region. We could talk about Syria and Turkey and Iran today with this extraordinary panel, but also just a note that John Kerry is in Tel Aviv, or about to leave Tel Aviv. He had a news conference this morning. He did not make his scheduled stop in Abu Dhabi. He stayed an extra couple of days in the region, had just been to Ramallah for another meeting with Abbas, his third meeting with Abbas in 3 days, after 6 hours of talks with Netanyahu last night. So this is clearly not as far as he had wanted. I think having invested this much time in the last couple of days, he really wanted to announce an agreement to get back to the talks and eliminate a lot of the preconditions and the underbrush. But I'm not sure, it's clear that they're not quite there. In any case, to hear from our eminent panelists, Madeleine Albright really needs no introduction. You know that she is now the chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group, but most importantly, and also continuously teaching at Georgetown to the delight of the faculty and students there. But she was the first woman Secretary of State. I know that seems sort of commonplace now, but believe me, when I was watching her being sworn in, it was not commonplace. And a woman had never been at the top of the State Department, a department that had been known for many years for its discrimination against women Foreign Service officers, all of which changed under Madeleine Albright, and as well as a lot of other things. And as you know, she was the very powerful and passionate ambassador to the United Nations before that. Dr. Richard Haass has spent the last 10 years at the helm of the Council on Foreign Relations, revitalizing it and in an extraordinary way in terms of its reach. He had previously been at the White House, the State Department, and the Defense Department in senior posts, close advisor, of course, a deputy to Brent Scowcroft in the National Security Council. He has just published his 12th book. I recommend it to all of you. Foreign Policy Begins at Home, The Case for Putting America's House in Order. And that, of course, is a provocative thesis to come from the President of the Council of Foreign Relations. It has just this weekend been named by the Financial Times as one of the must-read books of the year. So take that advice as well. And Mona Eltahawy is an award-winning columnist and journalist and speaker on Arab and Muslim issues. She was a Reuters correspondent for nearly 6 years, reporting from across the Middle East and North Africa. And she most memorably and with great personal cost, to say the least, was one of the victims in Tahrir Square and has been speaking out for the women who were so critical to that revolution and have now been, well, we'll hear from Mona as to the role of women now in Egyptian society as well as across the region. First, to you, Madam Secretary. What we're seeing in Cairo is really the culmination of a year of failures, arguably by the Morsi government, and a failure of the sort of nexus between what was described as a free and fair election and the ability to govern in an inclusive way. Are we at a stage where we can have these elections, but then non-secular passions come to play?
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here, and great to see so many people. And you've asked a very difficult question. I, among other things, am chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, which is part of the Endowment for Democracy. And we have been working on democracy since 1983 and basically founded by Ronald Reagan. So this is not a new idea. What is more complicated is how democracy evolves in the social media age and how you get from what I see, how do you get from Tahrir Square to governance? I think it is very exciting to see people out there voicing their views, but, and to have an election. And this is very hard to say, being who I am. Elections are necessary but not sufficient. And if one focuses only on elections and doesn't focus on institution building that is required in order to have democracy work, then you've only got half the story. And so the issue here is, how do you channel the information that the people have? I often talk about what's going on with social media as the Californiization. That's a hard word to say properly. You can make a terrible mistake. When so many voices are loosed without any channels of communication, which is why I believe in political parties and some kind of institutional structures. You also have to have the rule of law and a way of really channeling. So what we're watching is this kind of disintegration because there's no way to get from here to there. And I think the question is how, in fact, to combine those voices with some kind of institutional structure. The thing that happened was because the Mubarak government had basically outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood, they, in their own way, were able to create an organization, also developed constituency services in a variety of ways, while the others, the opposition, was kind of disaggregated. And so some of this is an institutional issue and a problem. And frankly, I don't think we have a clue where this is going because there is not any control mechanism at the moment. And clearly, President Morsi has failed in what he was elected to do for whatever reason. And that's what I'm sure we're going to talk about. But you can't say that this is a success if, in fact, there are people out in the streets and that there's no functioning system.
Richard, does Morsi have to be replaced? Is he going to be overthrown? Is there going to be a military coup? I mean, what would you, if you were sitting in the Situation Room right now, where people are sitting and watching this, as well as at other agencies around the Beltway, what would you be predicting and telling the commanders and the president?
Well, basically, let me say, I tend to agree with virtually everything Secretary Albright said, and you know, the key to it, I think, is the difference between what you might call electocracies and democracies. And elections, the fact that you had an election in Egypt is all well and good, but what we're now seeing is just how far you have to go before you have anything like a functioning democracy, and you need the checks and balances within government, between government and society, the evolution of civil society, and virtually none of that existed before the elections. And it was part of the nature, if you will, of the top-heaviness of the Mubarak era. And I would simply say we're, at best, we are in the early stages or innings, whatever metaphor you want to use, of what one day might be seen as a democratization process within Egypt. The problem is when you have millions of people in the streets, government is seen as unresponsive and illiberal, the process of democratization could very easily go off the rails. And We've seen that with democracies that are farther along in Brazil and Turkey. This is one that is extremely immature. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I just mean that in a descriptive sense. It's very early moments. Look, what you want to do is discourage violence, not our calls for peace and all that. People tend to come out in the streets when they feel that the normal avenues of political engagement are meaningless or denied to them. The question then is two basic, I guess, scenarios at least. One is that you have tremendous violence, and then what happens then? There's no real police in Egypt. It's really the military playing that role. Are they willing to use force? If you recall, when Mubarak was in trouble, the military would not be drawn into that role. They were frightened that they would lose legitimacy and their own positions and privileges would be jeopardized. So one question is what role, if any, they take. Is the opposition in the streets orderly, disorderly? Essentially, what does it look like in 24 hours? But no matter what, the real challenge for the United States, more important for Egyptians, well, how do you get this back on the rails to democratization? And then the question is, if the Morsi government survives this, what sort of lessons do they take from it? What sort of reforms do they begin to institute? So people basically say traditional politics has promise and legitimacy. Or if they don't take those kinds of lessons and they just crack down, then I think basically we're on a cycle of increasing polarization, violence. You'll have interruptions of what you might call democratic rule, and then you'll have to basically start the process up again.
Mona, you have experienced this firsthand in the worst possible way. Arrested by the Interior Ministry, assaulted, beaten. You wrote a very provocative piece in Foreign Policy, Why Do They Hate Us?, about the role of women in these societies. Can Morsi survive, and should he survive?
I think the problem with both the Morsi government and the US administration is that they think the Egyptians haven't changed. That basically Morsi has inherited a country of the same type of people that Mubarak ran for 30 years, and that 5 successive US administrations supported him in running. What the Morsi government and the US administration, primarily through the ambassador in Cairo, Ambassador Ann Patterson, failed to recognize is that the number of people on the street today are saying a very loud no, in the way that we said no to Mubarak, and in the way that we said no to the military junta that took over after we got rid of Mubarak. And that no is for very simple reasons. Mohamed Morsi was elected by a wide cross of Egyptians. I think the best way to summarize it is through one of the banners being held across the streets of Cairo today as people march from Tahrir to Eltahawy Palace. And that banner says, with Islam against the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's just to represent the Muslims in Egypt. And obviously not all Egyptians are Muslim or observant Muslims, because we have a substantial Christian population. But that distinction is really important, because I think that, and this is where we're broadening it up to Europe and our Western allies as well in Egypt, for the longest time, as long as the Mubarak regime was in power and suppressing the Muslim Brotherhood, it was always thought that Egyptians, given a choice, will go to Islamists, and that is utterly false. Egyptians wanted a choice in the way that you have a choice here and Europeans have a choice. The reason Morsi became president was because the false choice we were given was a religious fundamentalist president and a candidate for the military junta. So I have lots of friends who, with great difficulty, voted for Morsi because they didn't want the junta guy. But when you have this broad base of people voting for you, it sends you a clear message that we want you to be the president of Egypt and not the president of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Morsi became the president of the Muslim Brotherhood and began imprisoning and detaining political opponents who voted for him.
But isn't it likely, if Morsi is overthrown, isn't it likely to be replaced by the military? By
Well,
that
we
exact
don't want that
opposite
scenario.
choice?
What many people in Egypt are calling for, and this is where the US administration can play a role, because the US continues to pay Egypt in aid $1.5 billion every year, despite all the failings of the Mubarak regime and now the failings of Morsi. What Morsi needs to know is that he needs to broaden his base. He needs to bring in the opposition. He's been appointing ministers and governors, basically from the Muslim Brotherhood, from the Islamist support, and from the former regime.
Well, let me ask Madeleine, are we not using the leverage we have with the Morsi government to force it, to encourage it strongly, given that we're really bankrolling its future? Are we not using the leverage diplomatically to make it be more inclusive for the minorities?
Well, let me say, I think I do not speak on behalf of the United
No,
States government, but The bottom line is I think one has to see this a little bit also from the American perspective. Egypt has been very important to the United States for many years. It is central to a lot of Middle Eastern policy. We don't always get to choose the leader. We have to work with the leader who has been elected. Part of the issue is, what are American national interests in the region? Our interests are, frankly, some stability of a variety of kind, and then also a very important relationship with Israel. There is no question that I worked in the Carter administration. The Camp David Accords were a central aspect of this, and part of it is this whole aid kind of ratio between the amount of money that is given to Israel and the amount of money that is given to Egypt, and a lot of the money that is given to Egypt is a guarantee of that treaty. And I think that's something that Americans know, many of them, many who do not. We do not control what is going on in Egypt. I happen to think, this is again my personal opinion, that we need to condition the assistance we give to Egypt, but to cut it off completely, we would lose all leverage. We would lose it all. And so the question is how you condition it in terms of what they allow. I just said I think Morsi has failed in a particular part, and something that Richard mentioned. Democracy, you can't have majoritarian democracy. You have to recognize that if you have majority rule, you have to have minority rights. And Egypt is a particularly complicated country in terms of not being all Muslims. There are the Coptic Christians and a variety of different groups within it, and Morsi has forgotten that. The thing that I had maintained earlier was I still do not believe that the Muslim Brotherhood is a completely monolithic organization. And I think there was some thought that Morsi was not necessarily run by the most conservative parts of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think I do not defend Morsi, but clearly there is a very complicated situation in the variety of groups and a lack of understanding of the minority aspects. But from an American perspective, this is a very important country to us. And I actually think Ann Patterson is a remarkable ambassador.
Can I say one thing there?
Please.
Which is, I'm also, think well of Ann. We're former colleagues. But I do think the perception in Egypt among a lot of people who are not, shall we say, instinctively sympathetic to this government in Egypt is that the United States is giving Morsi a pass and giving this government a pass because it got elected. And I think that's a mistake. Yes, they got elected, and that's, if you will, you get points for that, but you don't get a pass for that. And since he is not governed in a way that I would argue is democratic. So I think what you have here is a consensus, is that U.S. aid needs to be conditional. And the Egyptians are going to complain about that. They're going to say, you're infringing our sovereignty. And I would say, so be it. You have the sovereign right not to accept American aid. We have the sovereign right to condition it. You don't want to accept it on these terms? Great. Go do without it, get aid from other places, which in some cases, by the way, they have. And that aid will not be in any way conditioned. We have to understand that. But I think we should be publicly and privately, we should speak out for the principles we believe in, and we should basically stand for democratization in Egypt. And constantly talk, yes, about Egypt's importance and all that, but we've got to change the tone and the substance of our policy. It's also possible, so now, if I haven't been controversial yet, let me be now, that you could have the military get involved. Just imagine that is a possible scenario. And I would simply say, if that were to happen, the United States needs to take a deep breath. And before we start condemning anybody, before we start talking about aid cutoffs, we need to think for a second and say, what is our goal here? Our goal is democratization. So what we should then do is work with whoever is in power, whether it's Morsi, whether it's the military, whether it's somebody else, and say, we will have a conditional relationship. We will talk to you about a roadmap, a schedule, what will be the principles of governance, what will be the calendar of it, and we will then figure out how we will react to that, what kind of aid we will give you to facilitate that process. We should avoid, if you will, being, quote unquote, so principled that if we see setbacks to democracy, that our relationship, we toss it over the edge. Madeleine's exactly right. We have a big long-term relationship with this country that's somewhere between a quarter and a third of the Arab world, one of the great centers, if you will, of the Arab world, in the peace relationship with Israel, very much a participant directly and indirectly in the intellectual and political clashes of going on in this part of the world today. So we've got to play this for the long haul, not just react tactically.
There's so, yeah, Mona weigh in, but I want to move on to Syria and sort of regional impact as
solve
well.
this.
We've solved Egypt.
I want to say something. I want to say something about Egypt before we move on to the easier example of Syria. I think
We didn't tell you there would be any easy answers today.
there are moments that come along where we expect much stronger language, not just the conditionality. I agree with the conditionality on aid, but a very recent example was a trial of non-governmental organizations in Egypt, the NGO trial. Right. And one of them was NDI. And NDI, the NDI office, the IR office, German, European, various non-government organizations.
One of the people arrested was the son of a cabinet secretary here.
But here's where the U.S. stumbled, and stumbled badly.
Agreed.
NDI, I mean, a very good friend of mine is a man called Robert Becker, who was running the NDI office. He was the only American who refused to leave Cairo to stand trial with his Egyptian colleagues, and for that I salute him. And NDI fired him. Why? And the U.S. Embassy did not offer him any support.
We have to let Madeleine respond to that since she chairs.
I would love to hear what Madam Secretary says. But the U.S. administration, more importantly, said very little. The Europeans were much more harsh on the Morsi administration. Now, this trial began under the military junta, continued under Morsi, but it bodes very badly for the kind of democratization building that we're all speaking about, because they're cracking down against NGOs.
Madeleine?
Robert Becker had different reasons for staying there than democratization, and I don't wish to talk about it. He is not the person that you think he is. The bottom has, in fact, been arrested. We have been tried and sentenced illegally, and we are trying to figure out what to do about the sentence. But it is a serious problem. And I think part of the issue here is that the facts are not out there. There is no question that Konrad Adenauer Foundation, various ones, have been, our offices were raided. We had to take them for safety into the embassy. We had to evacuate them. We have been trying to deal with it. But I think that what we need to do is understand you are for every reason passionate, and I admire you so much. I could not have survived what you survived. But I think that what we have is a very complex situation, and democratization is a complex issue. And I do think, I stand by what the NGOs have done, I stand by NDI's work, and I am appalled at the sentence that was meted out to the people on completely phony charges. But we have to know what the facts are.
Speaking of the facts, we don't have facts. We don't have good reporting from inside Syria. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence. The latest UN figures are 100,000 people dead. Madeleine, when you were in the Clinton administration, you were such a passionate advocate for action in Bosnia. We know what happened when you argued with Colin Powell memorably about that. What should the U.S. role be in Syria?
Well, I think one of the hardest parts is taking one event and moving it to another area. I personally wish that we had done something earlier in Syria, and that often people say too little, too late, but the bottom line is it doesn't get us from here to there. I think we are where we are on it. President Obama has been very careful about this for good reason, and some of it is some of the stuff that Richard's been writing about, is worrying about what's happening at home. I think that if I might say, I think that President Obama is dealing with what has been the greatest disaster in American foreign policy, which is the war in Iraq, that made it very difficult for the United States to move into another area where our views on do we get involved in another war in the Middle East in Islam. So I believe that what the President is doing in terms of now providing some more military assistance to the rebels is a good idea. What I think has to happen is there is no military solution to this. I think they need to go to Geneva for a political solution. But if I might say, I am obviously the oldest person on the stage, though not necessarily the oldest in Aspen.
Not even close. Not even
Can I just say, age is a state of mind, and Madeleine was on a panel, was observing a panel last night. I saw you leaving around 11 o'clock last night. You are the youngest person on the stage.
No, but I think the thing that what we need to think about is the things that we have viewed in the last century and this one. I think what we're seeing in the Middle East generally is the biggest change in our lifetimes. probably bigger than the end of communism. And I think part of it is a massive battle between the Shia and the Sunni, and the Persians and the Arabs, and a lot of it is playing out in Syria. And if you think that we're in for the long run in Egypt, this is a long story in the Middle East. And I think that's the way that we have to see what we're doing in Syria.
Richard, you've spoken of it as a 30-year war. It's already been more than 30 years since Camp David.
Well, that's a different, if you will,
Different
fault
nexus.
line. That's the fault line that's for so long dominated perceptions of the Middle East, which was the Israeli-Arab fault line. And actually, I think that's become the least of the fault lines in the region.
So do you think that I want to get back to the bigger
Yeah,
issue,
sure.
but do you think that what the Secretary of State is doing right now is a distraction or a sideshow, if you will,
Well,
investing so much time in an issue that is no longer the central issue of the region?
are those cameras working?
Yeah.
I hope so.
It's
It's just between us, as some
Just
people
between
said.
won't go any further than this tent. Okay. Yeah, I would make 3 points on this. And I'd love to be wrong. And the good news is I often am. The first is I think the prospects for peace between Israelis and Palestinians are bleak. Whether talks begin or not, I think the prospects are bleak. And that's essentially because the prerequisites aren't there. You've got a divided Palestinian leadership, and there's virtually no evidence that Palestinian polity is prepared to move on certain basic issues from Israel's perspective. You've got an Israeli government that was cobbled together far left and far right, not to make peace, essentially rather to make sure that the Orthodox minority in Israel played a larger role in the society and the economy. That's the one thing they agreed on. This is not a cabinet, if you will, that is positioned to make peace. So my first point is I simply don't think on either side you have leadership that is willing and able to make compromises that in any way would meet what the other side requires. Secondly, if I'm wrong, and I hope I am, and there was significant progress on this front, I do not believe it would change one iota the debate, to the extent there is one, or the drive within Iran to acquire the prerequisites of nuclear weapons. I do not believe for a second it would have shaped the dynamic of the intense civil conflict going on in Syria. I do not believe it would change what we were just talking about on the streets of Egypt. The Israeli-Palestinian dispute matters tremendously to Israelis and Palestinians. I do not believe it holds the key to the future of this part of the world, which I really do think is perched on a multi-decade struggle, not simply between Sunnis and Shia, but between Islamists of various stripes and secularists and so forth. I think the Middle East, 30 years war, possibly longer, but I actually think maps are going to be withdrawn. Societies are going to go through a tremendous, tremendous degree of stress and turbulence. And lastly, one of the most important things, and Madeleine understands this better than anyone probably in this tent, when you're in senior positions in government, you've only got so many hours in the day. You've only got so much bandwidth. There's only so many countries you can be in any one time. There's almost only so much political and diplomatic capital you have. It's very interesting that Secretary Kerry had to delay his trip, not simply cancel it to the UAE, but delay it going out to Asia. And I simply think that there's an opportunity cost in doing more on the Arab-Israeli thing, simply because this is time. It sends the signal to Asia that despite all the talk of an American pivot or rebalancing, that we are still preoccupied with the Middle East. And I think when the history of the 21st century is likely to be written, it's far more likely to be written in Asia than it is in the Middle East, because it's Asia where the great powers of this era of history are present. They are not present in the Middle East. It's not an either or, it's a question of balance. But yes, I would have questions about what's going
Madeleine
on.
wants to
Well,
jump
let
in.
me just say, I was in Asia recently, and somebody said, so what are you going to do about Western Asia? And I thought, what is Western Asia? It's the Middle East.
Maybe if we just relabeled everything, it would all work out.
Yeah, but let me
mean,
just
that-
say the following thing, is I think the Arab-Israeli issue within the whole context of the Middle East is very complex in the following way, which is that there are those in the Middle East that always blame the Israeli-Palestinian issue for not going forward on a whole host of other issues. I don't happen to agree with that. Who, me? No.
No. Okay. We're fine.
Yeah, anyway,
No, we're fine.
I think that, so I do think that it's,
Madeleine, I think it's okay if you just clip it on.
all right, well, I'll just hold it for now. So, that it's out there as an issue. I also can understand that Secretary Kerry, who has understood these issues and worked on them for a long time, thinks that he sees an opportunity. So I don't see it as a distraction, because it's always out there as let's blame Israel or the Israeli-Palestinian issue for not moving forward on other issues. But I can tell you, if I were to ask any of you whether you'd like to go to Camp David, I think you'd say yes. I can tell you after 2 weeks in the rain with the Israelis and Palestinians, I don't ever want to go back. So the bottom line is this is very difficult, and I do think that Secretary Kerry is doing the right thing, but he does have to do other things. There is no question. And the United States cannot be the ones to lay down a plan and solve the problem, but we do have the power to bring the parties together. So I think I applaud what he's doing, but he's got an awful lot of other work that he has to do.
And just to be clear, what he is doing is trying to get rid of some of the obstacles that have torpedoed past peace talks so that they don't get back to the table only to splinter apart. So he's actually trying to negotiate some of those remaining issues that have caused so much difficulty, but they haven't been face-to-face in 3 years, and they haven't accomplished something for far longer than that. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how it resonates internally now, because I think for me, I was born right after the 1967 war. I had two uncles who fought in 73. I lived in Jerusalem as a Reuters correspondent, so the conflict has obviously interwoven itself into my life and the lives of many people from the Middle East and North Africa. And I think when you look at what's been happening since the revolutions and uprisings began in Tunisia with Mohamed Bouazizi and then spread across various countries, and even in the countries that do not have protests on the street but have been watching, they're not watching passively. What is happening, I think, was very nicely summed up by a Tunisian man who said something to a close friend of mine who was visiting. Soon after they got rid of Ben Ali. And he said, you know, I'm a Tunisian, my mind is in France, and, you know, I follow Western literature, and that's, you know, intellectually, you could call me, quote unquote, Western. My feet are in Tunisia, because, you know, I'm a Tunisian, and I'm very proud of this revolution. But my heart is very much an Arab, and I will never forget Palestine or the Palestinians. So I think what you've seen in the region for decades is dictators, largely supported by the US again. I mean, as Madam Secretary mentioned, the aid to Egypt is tied to the Camp David Accord, is tied to peace between Egypt and Israel. So you've had a succession of dictators who've distracted internal issues with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict so that we don't focus on the mess they've created of our countries inside. But this moment came along when people were fed up of that, and so they focused on Tunisia, on Egypt, on Yemen, on Bahrain, on other countries, but have not forgotten the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So don't think that it's gone or that people don't care about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think for me as an Egyptian, the best way that I can help Palestinians end occupation is to make Egypt strong and to have a strong Egyptian government. Now, when Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood try to use the Israel-Palestine card the way that Mubarak did, he can't. Because for the longest time, Islamists acted like they owned the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And now we have a Muslim Brotherhood president who's willing to keep the peaceful relations between Egypt and Israel. I'm not calling for war, that's not what I'm calling for. What I am saying is that when Islamists are outside of government, they also try to use the Israel-Palestine card. But once in government, they recognize they couldn't, because the people on the streets in Cairo today are calling for bread, are calling for social justice, are calling to fix Egypt. So we're calling to fix our individual countries. And very quickly about the Islamist secular thing, because our panel is about secularists and Islamists. I actually think, although it saddens me deeply that the Egyptian economy is on the brink of collapse, that many Egyptians are struggling to make ends meet and are hungry, and that there are lines, horrendous lines, outside of gas stations, I actually think it's the best thing possible that the Muslim Brotherhood are now in government in Egypt, because they have unmasked themselves for the terrible job of governing that they've done in a way that none of us could have done. They've done us a huge favor. So what we're now doing is we're telling them, you can't use this Islam card anymore. When I was a journalist in Cairo in the 1990s, we would ask them, what do you represent? because they love to play the victim. Mubarak imprisons us, Mubarak tortures us. So we would say, what's your platform? And they would say, Islam is the solution. And that is nonsense. Islam is not the solution. The solution is to give people jobs. The solution is to make sure that cars are not lining up outside gas stations for hours. The solution is to make sure that torture under the Muslim Brotherhood government, when they themselves were tortured, is just as bad as it was under Mubarak and the junta. So this is a moment where the political Islamists' facade is finally being removed. And that's why I'm telling you, when Muslims go to vote, we don't want to vote for Islamists, we want a choice. We don't want empty slogans like Islam is the solution. We want, I'm going to give your son and daughter a job, I'm going to make the streets safe, I'm going to reform the Interior Ministry, which broke my arms and sexually assaulted me and killed hundreds and thousands of Egyptians throughout decades of dictatorship. So this is a fantastic moment. As difficult as it is for me as an Egyptian to watch Egypt on the so-called brink, this is a great moment for us to finally move beyond dictatorship and military and Islamists.
So, Richard, this brings us back to governance, because the real origins, as Mona has just said, in Tunisia and in Egypt, were economic and political privation, and a young generation that had no opportunity. And when I talk to my friends and colleagues in Cairo in the past year, increasingly what they complain about is lack of civil order.
I heard what Mona said, and I listened to it carefully, and I hope she's right, but here's my concern. My concern is twofold, and they come actually from opposite sides. One is the Iranian example. The Iranian revolution now is 34 years old. And what we've seen is one, in this case, the Iranian quote-unquote Islamists, who have, I understand, a fairly unique fusion of the political and the religious. But once they got in power, they have entrenched themselves. And we have now had an extremely illiberal, dangerous Iran for 3.5 decades. So one of the things, I mean, we used to call it in the State Department, one man, one vote, one time. Once these groups get into power, and we've seen Morsi actually try to do it, is entrench themselves. To use democracy, at least, or the voting box to get into, the voting booth to get into power, and then to systematically weaken some of the constraints of democracy. So that is one of the concerns I have. It doesn't necessarily turn out well. Secondly, simply because people march in the street does not mean they put themselves into a position to challenge for political authority. We saw that in Tahrir Square originally. What we've seen repeatedly, the one thing the Egyptian opposition seems to be able to do besides march in the streets is boycott. What we've not seen them be able to do is organize. They have not posed a serious political organized alternative to the Muslim Brothers. So until they do, the two most, you have basically the people in the street who are not organized, you've got the Muslim Brothers and other Islamists, and you've got the military, which can't decide what its role is in the political system. So what we're not yet seeing in the Middle East is the emergence of a serious, largely secular, or at least somewhat a religious, if you will, role in politics, but one that is limited. A real commitment to constitutionalism, we are not seeing it. And until we do, I, for one, am not confident of where we're going. And it's one of the reasons I personally never use the phrase Arab Spring. I am unpersuaded that in any way we have seen the evidence in this part of the world that we have passed the point where that we've reached a point where we can assume that democracy has a serious future anytime soon. I'd love to see it. I don't think, though, the evidence is in.
Madeleine, you were just a week ago in Jordan at the refugee camps, which have now become an enormous burden for King Abdullah, who some feel his clock is ticking because of the increasing economic burden, refugees still from the Iraq War in Jordan. We have other, what you might call more moderate monarchies, more moderate, I'm using that phrase very, advisedly, Mona, who are facing increasing challenge from Islamicists and others simply wanting more democracy.
Well, I think we're dealing, as I said earlier, with a hugely complicated phenomenon. And a lot of people have compared this to the post-communist time. Very different. There's no question that the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, they all wanted to be part of the West. Oh, I constantly keep being asked the comparison of the two.
And are much more homogenous.
Very different. And so I agree with Richard, there are a whole host of issues that are very different. And with this is economic. The man who immolated himself in Tunisia did so because he didn't have the money to buy the vegetables and things that he was selling, because his mother could not inherit the land after his father because of the laws about women not being able to inherit the land. This would be a great women's story, except that one of the things that happened was that he was disrespected by a woman officer, which is one of the things that made him mad. So, but it has been an economic story. Then, and I have to say, I listen to you, Mona, and I so am moved by what you say, but the Tahrir Square is a leaderless movement, and that is part of the problem. And the leaders that are there, theoretically al-Baradei and Amr Moussa, are not doing the job for whatever reason there is. And so I have spent a lot of time working on various parts of democratization. It is really difficult, and it does require some kind of institutional structures. And then I also say, in a Muslim country, it is more than likely that Muslims will be elected to office. So we have to figure out which ones are the ones that can be worked with. But the institutional structure is important. So one of the things we've been talking about, King Mohammed of Morocco is, when one looks at, you divide things into which are the monarchies, and there are King Abdullah, and then two King Abdullahs, and then also King Mohammed, and they are trying to figure out in their own way how to liberalize their system. I think so far King Mohammed of Morocco is the more successful, but King Abdullah is trying to deal with a country of 7 million people that if they had the number of, their equivalent number of refugees is as if we had 40 million refugees in this country. We can't even deal with 11 million people that are here. So I think we have to understand the job situation in Jordan, its proximity to Syria, the fact that it is host to all these people, and some attempt to try to get some kind of institutionalized change. Pretty tough job.
Can I bring in
I
Libya?
want to bring in the audience.
Can I say something very quickly about Libya and Tunisia? And I think Libya and Tunisia give great examples that can move us a bit closer to the direction we're talking about. In Libya, it was thought, you know, fait accompli, the Islamists are going to win, and they didn't. And the Libyans have a different set of problems. The Libyans' problems are to do with militia and rule of law and justice, and they're currently trying to figure out who's going to write their constitution. If you jump over to neighboring Tunisia, where you have Islamists in power, and you have a constituent assembly that was voted in, they're now on to the fourth draft of their constitution. They're doing a much better job on their constitution than we did in Egypt, where Morsi just assumed tremendous powers for himself and just, you know, basically kind of fast-boiled a constitution. Now I'm watching the Tunisian example, and I'm worried obviously about women in Tunisia, because Tunisia had a very progressive constitution, especially regarding women's rights. But what I'm seeing happening in Egypt that I hope is going to move us beyond the problems and the questions you both have, is that the movement that called for the protest today, called Tamarrud, which means rebel, is not affiliated to any of the political opposition leaders, because quite frankly, many of the political opposition leaders are out of touch with the street. So you now have an emerging group of young people who are going to be our future. It's the gap between now and then that is the problem, but they're moving ahead.
I think the argument still holds that it's so far leaderless in terms of a political movement.
10 seconds. Any group that calls itself rebel, that tells you they've got a problem. They know what they're against. They do not know what they're for. And that, to me, is emblematic of what's going on in the Middle East. Everybody knows what they're against. They're all against the Mubaraks, the Assads, whatever. But as soon as you succeed at getting rid of the ancien regime, that's when the consensus completely gets dismantled. And what we're not seeing are the tolerant, liberal, secular voices who are accepting of religion, but in a still limited place. We are not seeing them coalescing and becoming politically meaningful movements, and that is why I am still skeptical.
Let's let people in the audience, because we're running out of time, and I can see people already lining up. We've got microphones, so right there.
It's been a wonderful panel. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Many Americans view our policy in the Middle East with great frustration because it seems to have no impact or little impact. My question is really, what are the levers that we should be using that we're not?
Madeleine?
Well, I do think that, first of all, this is a very hard, I do not believe that the United States is a declining power. Let me just say that flat out. But what requires is to cooperate with other countries. Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and ends in an ism. But what it means is partnerships, and I think that what needs to be developed is more international approach towards the Middle East. That's one part of the leverage, and we need to do that. The other is that our assistance programs are leverage. There's no question, and if you look at what the budget is and what Congress is allowing for what is known as foreign assistance, which is a mistake to put those two words together, it needs to be national security support, and that is leverage in the way that you give it, do you condition it. I also do think that we need to figure out which groups we support in a country, and the hardest parts is that the groups do not agree within themselves, and therefore, Richard, when you say rebel, part of the problem is there are these opposition and this and that, and so that part is very hard, and we always have various other parts of our national security toolbox, which is the threat of the use of force. But we need to keep all the options on the table, but also recognize that this is not solely our story this time.
That's what I think the key is. If you look at the kinds of things we've been talking about here, the question for political order and legitimacy in Egypt, the civil war in Syria, the possibility of instability in Jordan and Saudi Arabia, I would simply suggest that these are exactly the kinds of scenarios where the United States, where our influence is extraordinarily limited. That, we had more than 2.5 million Americans served at one time or another trying to remake the societies of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I would simply say we ought to have learned some lessons, that despite extraordinary sacrifice and effort, there were real limits to what it is the United States can accomplish when our goal is to remake or heavily influence the trajectory of societies and political systems. And I would simply say, if I am right, then when I look at the next couple of decades in the Middle East, we had better be prepared for the fact that we will have at best limited influence, no matter what it is we do. So yes, we should condition our aid. Yes, we should say things. Yes, we should use all the levers of our power. But if tomorrow there's massive instability in Saudi Arabia, I would simply suggest that American options are quite, I'll use a generous word, finite. So there's things we can and cannot do. In Syria, again, we could do massive amounts of things that I would oppose. But no one should assume that simply because we do a lot, we would have a lot to show for it. The kinds of situations we're looking at tend to be the sorts of situations that history suggests resist the efforts of outsiders to meaningfully affect.
There's a question over here. Can we have a microphone over here? The gentleman right there. Thank you.
Where is the
Do you want to stand up so we can?
Yes.
Thank
Where
you.
is the Iran nuclear program headed, and is there a solution?
I'm so glad you asked that question because Richard Haass is one of the few people here who's actually negotiated and dealt with the Iranians in a previous regime.
You can see with what success.
And Richard, was there a window before the Axis of Evil speech where we actually were working with the Iranians on Afghanistan and other issues? Was there some chance under Khatami to do something?
It's one of those things, Andrea, that'll be debated. It's basically, we're talking about in the couple of years after 2001. And there was some indication, shall we say, that what the United States did after 2001 got the attention of the Iranians. And that then there were certain possible signals from them that there might have been greater willingness to be flexible. We didn't particularly test them, so one answer is we won't know. The other is, though, I would say the Iranians have had repeated opportunities to show their moderation, and I haven't seen them exploit them. So even if there were moments right after 9/11 where for tactical reasons they might have been willing to adjust some of what they were doing, I don't think strategically we've seen an indication that they were willing to either fundamentally moderate their ambitions in the region, many of which, by the way, were enabled by the Iraq War, and I don't see that they have been willing to significantly do more than adjust the pace and scope of their nuclear program. My guess is we're going to have the big test now. I actually think with the election of Mr. Rouhani, we can debate all we want what real power he's going to have. I would simply say, let's find out. Let's put forward a very ambitious offer. Let's be generous in what would accrue to the Iranians, were they to accept significant limits on their nuclear program and give us confidence that they weren't cheating. Let them have a public debate, put pressure on the regime, let the regime try to explain why it's rejecting a reasonable offer from the world that would, among other things, raise the standard of living of all Iranians. And if they accept something like that, great. If they don't, then at least we will have clarity, and then we can have a serious debate about the use of force or whether we are prepared to live with certain Iranian capabilities.
Madeleine, is there a military option?
Well, there always is, but I think that the issue is what does it bring? And what we're looking with Iran is unintended consequences of previous foreign policy decisions, and so we have to be very careful about. We were in office when Khatami was first elected, and I did deal with the Iranians, but I think a lesson here is the following, and I think a mistake we made in many ways was embracing Khatami too much. He became kind of our favorite.
That discredited him
And I think it
internally.
did, so I think we have to be careful with Rouhani in the same way. On the other hand, I agree with what Richard has said in terms of trying to put forward some plan. I think that this came up in the panel last night. The bottom line is the Iranians are signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have a right to a peaceful nuclear program if, in fact, it is fully monitored by the IAEA, which is a big if. But that is one of the things that people have to look at. We need to negotiate with them, and we need to put forward some good ideas.
I was in Geneva in 2009 when we thought we had negotiated with them a deal where they could keep their medical reactor, the Tehran reactor, send the enriched fuel to Russia, and we thought that was an agreement. Their negotiators held news conferences with us. They went back, and the Ayatollah said, I never agreed to that.
He's the one in charge.
So that is the...
That's why they call him the supreme leader.
That's why they call it the Supreme Court. There's this word supreme, you know. That
Andrea, can I say something really quick? It's not specific to Iran, but it touches on what Richard said about American influence and the earlier question. I think it's a good thing that it's perceived more and more that the U.S. has less influence in those countries because of something that you said, Madam Secretary, which is that it seemed to discredit people. But I think that the reverse of that is to recognize that U.S. foreign policy, and I say this as an Egyptian American now because I became naturalized in 2011, U.S. foreign policy must not sacrifice the cause for freedom of the people on the ground for the sake of stability. This is the big challenge now. How are American U.S. interests met, but not at the expense of the people who are putting their lives on the line for the kind of freedom that America has preached to the world for so long?
And we've got a question right here, if we can get a microphone close to the front. Thank you. We only have a few minutes left.
Yes.
So.
Since we're running out of time, I'm really interested in hearing your perspective on the rights of women in the Middle East and sort of what is, yes, you're very welcome. I was waiting for it. So if you could talk a little bit about what you see in terms of prospects for some of the freedoms that women have been working towards in some of these economies, I would be grateful.
And let me just also expand it to say that I've spent a lot of time with Afghan women who had achieved so much but are now at such risk. They are business owners. We've met with them. They've been encouraged by administrations going back to the very good work that Laura Bush did. There is a co-ed American university in Kabul, and their graduates, their students are really impressive. And these students are standing up to their own fathers in some cases to go to this university. But a lot of this is now at risk under the withdrawal. Madeleine has worked very hard on this.
I'm so glad you asked this because if no one had asked it, I would have jumped in at the end and brought this up anyway because I feel very strongly about this. When I talk about the Muslim Brotherhood in the US, I like to compare them to what I call the Christian Brotherhood in the US. And this is the religious right and conservative men in this country who are successfully trying to roll back reproductive rights. And I always bring up Wendy Davis and what happened in Texas. And I say that Governor Rick Perry is an example of the Christian Brotherhood in this country. Now what they have in common is, thank you. Wait, there's more. What they have in common is the religious right, and especially the men of the religious right, are obsessed with our vaginas, and I always say, stay away from my vagina unless I want you in there. That is the lesson. So this is what we're going through in Egypt right now, and I bring Wendy Davis in Texas in because it doesn't help to say over there and over here. We have to look at women's rights and the successive fights to roll back reproductive rights. The Beijing platform from 1995, I was in Beijing at the conference. If we had a global conference today, we would not achieve a third of what we achieved in Beijing because of the growing conservatism, especially regarding reproductive rights. Now, what's happening in many parts of the Middle East and North Africa is that you've had lots of women side by side with men in the various revolutions, but because we're seeing a louder voice of these Islamists who are being voted in, they do not believe in gender equality. The Muslim Brotherhood does not believe in gender equality, but you're seeing grassroots feminist movements formed in the various countries. In Egypt, for example, we have a host of groups out there helping women fight against sexual assault that is targeted at getting them out of public space. When I speak to US audiences, and especially when I think of the US administration, I always say resist cultural relativism. Women's rights are women's rights, whether they're Muslim women, Jewish women, Hindu women, wherever they're from. And do not buy arguments. Stay out of this because it's our culture and religion. Women's rights are human rights, and they must not be sacrificed, again, for the sake of stability. So even though it might look dire in some countries, trust me, we're fighting. I moved back to Cairo in March to fight.
Mona, I just want to say, I was covering the conference in 1995 with Hillary Clinton on that delegation. The declaration that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights would not have happened without the leader, co-leader of that delegation, Madeleine Albright. So, Madeleine. We're just about out of time. Richard, and then I want to give Madeleine the last word.
One is on the issue we've been talking about. One of the many reasons the Middle East has not succeeded, and indeed in some ways it's the least successful region of the world compared to other regions, is the issue we're talking about. You can't deny opportunity to half your population hope to succeed. I also want to talk about one woman in particular, not so much rights but accomplishment. This week marks Andrea's 35th year with NBC News.
You see, Madeleine is not the oldest person on this. Thank you, Richard. Madeleine, this brings it full circle because the economic future of Egypt, of Tunisia, of any of these countries really relies on the inclusiveness of those societies. They cannot deny half of their populations economic opportunities because it's a self-defeating policy.
Well, I was with Hillary when she made the statement, and she electrified the whole place, and the Beijing platform has been a really important one. I was the first secretary to bring women's issues central to American foreign policy, not just because I'm a feminist, but because, in fact, if half the population or more in any country is not part of the system, then the country is robbed of an awful lot of smart people and resources. Women have to be politically and economically empowered in their societies. There is no question about that. I think the issue is how we keep pushing it, what we do, how we unite in terms of, it's very hard to argue with anything that Mona has said, but the truth is that people don't want to live in a completely unstable society. This is the problem that we have. Partially, and this happened in a number of revolutions, there are the revolutionary leaders who want to move forward, and then there are ordinary people who do not know how to get bread, who can't send their children to school, who just plead for some kind of order and organization. And so the thing that we have to do is pull these two concepts together of having people that are dynamic and are leaders in this, and at the same time try to develop the institutions that allow for some kind of stable societies. You cannot live with only people in the streets. It does not work. And so therefore, what I would argue for is to motivate and have people such as Mona and her colleagues pushing, and at the same time try to develop some kind of organizational structure, which is what NDI tries to do, IRI, a lot of other organizations, in order to, stability is not a bad thing. I think we have to think about it, and we have to figure out how to really marry these two concepts together, and women are much better at that, believe it or not.
Hear, hear. I just want to thank, this is arguably the best audience in Aspen. Thank you so much. Madeleine Albright, Mona Eltahawy, Richard Haass, thank you. It's been a privilege.